everyone. We're coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia. We're actually attending the Planet Textiles conference here, as well as the Sustainable Apparel Coalition membership meeting. So it's a great opportunity for us to interview some of our colleagues who are here as well. Today's topic is about financing the transition to a circular apparel system. Now, you all know that one of the working assumptions of this pod is that the apparel sector needs to rethink how fashion and apparel is produced, used, and consumed. For many, this means changing the apparel fashion system to reflect a circular system, right, within a circular economy, all powered by renewable energy. Moving from this linear take, make, waste system to a circular system is pretty revolutionary. And to get there, the industry is going to need to develop and scale a broad range of innovations, most likely including new business models. And we're going to have to do it very quickly. To help the industry move in this direction, a number of new initiatives have emerged, really giving us a taste of what kind of new thinking is required. These include the newly launched Apparel Impact Institute, which has emerged from the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, H&M Foundation's Global Change Award, the Fashion for Good Incubator and Fund, Launch, Ashoka's Fabric of Change initiative, Nike, I believe, just launched a new innovation challenge. This is just to name only a few. These initiatives are very important, and the ventures they encourage hold great promise. But assessed in the context of the resource needs facing the industry and society, and the timelines by when these new models must be mainstreamed, it's not clear that the amount of financial capital and investment currently channeled through these platforms is enough. In fact, it seems like that amount of money is relatively small to date. Significantly more financial capital investment is likely needed to incentivize the development of these solutions and ensure they can quickly achieve scale. So we want to explore this. What is the role of finance and investment in making this transition to a circular apparel system? How much capital do we think is needed, and by when? And where will it come from? We need to answer these fundamental questions, as well as what actions are needed to significantly accelerate investment. Today I call him Roger. Can you introduce yourself, actually?
Rogier van Mazijk.
Oh my God. I'm always so challenged, and you're very, very sweet to allow me to call you Roger. But you are the investment manager for the initiative Fashion for Good. And you're my guest, and we're going to chat about these financial issues, which is really interesting. So welcome to Big Closet, Small Planet. What do you think about my studio?
Thank you. It's excellent here in downtown Vancouver.
Yes, we have this sort of suite, and you may hear some construction on the outside, but we're doing as professional as we can.
Hopefully you don't hear too much of the construction works.
Right. Well, you did come in and you were surprised how professional we are here.
That is right.
Yes,
yeah.
That's very good. So first, tell us more, right? Tell us about Fashion for Good, why it's needed, and what you do there.
Right. So Fashion for Good is the global industry-wide platform that is focused on accelerating and scaling innovation. And we do that through collaborating with our network of participants of the industry. And we're focused merely on the fashion supply chain. So, as you said, my work as an investment manager is really focused on investments in innovation. So, funding for the startups. It seems from the surveys I see every time that funding for startups is really the highest priority for them. A lot of startups are actually stalled in their progress because they can't get funding. So what I try to do within Fashion for Good is connect those startups to funding as well. We also have a relatively small pool of capital ourselves that we can invest in seed money in those startups.
So how is the program structured? Do you have different stakeholders involved, companies, big brands? How does it work?
Yeah, so the way Fashion for Good operates, we operate as an industry-wide network. So we are really aimed at driving systemic change through collaborating with all of those stakeholders. So we like to instigate this collaboration through a pre-competitive environment that we create in our first hub in Amsterdam. So we work together with our corporate partners, who consist of brands and manufacturers who have joined us officially. We collaborate with innovators, a wider network of other initiatives that are partly also co-housed in our first hub in Amsterdam. So these are people like the SAC's European headquarters, ZDHC, the Organic Cotton Accelerator, and we also connect our network to funding that is required in order to progress these innovations.
And my understanding is you have some corporate partners. Is that how it's set up? That you have some of the companies who would ultimately like to receive the solutions and implement them?
That's right. So we work together with these corporate partners, and some have joined us officially in our program, in the innovation platform, and they also can indicate what sort of innovation they would like to see, so they can actively influence the innovation agenda that we have. That means that we pick those innovations that are most relevant to the actual players of the industry that can decide whether these are implemented or not.
So can you tell us who some of those partners are?
Yeah, sure. So our current partners consist of a lot of large brands such as Adidas, Target, Kering, CNA. And these together, these 8 or 9 brands that we have currently, or corporate partners that we have currently, are worth over 100 billion in revenue. So it's really a large chunk of the market.
Very interesting. So when we talk about innovations, because it sounds like Fashion for Good does a broad range of things, but one of your specialties is to support the development and scaling up of innovations. Can you give a few examples of what types of innovations you have identified or supporting, so the audience gets a sense of that?
Right. So what we see in the fashion industry is that you can focus on incremental upgrades, which might save you a couple of percentages in sustainability, or a couple of percent less bad. But because the industry is growing so fast, 3, 4, 5% per year in terms of volume for the next 15 years, we really have to focus on more radical innovation as well. So that's the sort of innovations that we would like to support, the more disruptive new technologies that can really make a big impact in a positive way on the industry. So the companies that are in our programs, the accelerator program and the scaling program, are typically that. So they're highly disruptive, they are very scalable. They have a primary focus on the fashion industry. It doesn't necessarily need to be a sole focus on the fashion industry. Many of our companies also focus on other industries at the same time, but it needs to be a primary focus. And we take them on across the supply chain. So they can be focused on raw material innovations, dyeing and finishing solutions, cut, make, trim, so automation and 3D printing. But also end of use and new sort of business models such as re-commerce. We also see a lot of things that are across the supply chain and can really be allocated to a single step. Examples of that could be traceability and transparency solutions. So yeah, to give you a few examples that you may have seen already in our session here yesterday, 2 days ago actually, we saw innovators like Colorzan, who do the pre-treatment of cotton so they can be dyed without water and with a huge energy reduction. Another dyeing innovation would be Or Yarkoni, so colorifics, that's the Or you talked to 2 days ago. And he is doing waterless dyeing with bacterial technologies. So really a different angle, but focused on the same problem, which is the dyeing industry.
So my understanding in that one is that they're able to sort of manipulate the DNA, is it, at that level, to sort of trigger the sort of creation of a color, right? And they can basically trigger the DNA to do almost any range of color if they just get the sequence right. And that means that you don't do any dyeing at all, right? I mean, it seems almost sort of futuristic in a strange way. Is that, did I describe it sort of correctly?
Yes, I agree, and I did feel like did share that thought that it is almost like a fantasy thing, and it's almost too good to be true. But he actually already dyed some dresses for Stella McCartney, for example, which was announced a few weeks ago. So it's really interesting to see how these fantasy sort of breakthrough innovations can actually be implemented in the industry and can actually be scaled as well. It's just up to the industry now to pick up this innovation and scale it to a mainstream practice.
So there was also a company called Mango Materials. What do they do?
Yeah, so they are very interesting, and they're in our current accelerator batch, so our third batch of the accelerator program. They convert methane gases, which is actually a very potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than CO2, and they convert that into biopolyesters, so biopolymers. And this is very interesting because it's obviously a net positive effect on the environment, and there's a lot of methane gas available to convert into these products. So they've already done that for bottle caps and buttons for t-shirts, for shirts, and now they are also focusing on the fashion industry, trying to spin that material into yarns that can be used in garments.
So in principle, that means that that our clothings could be sort of methane or sinks, right? They capture the methane that's already out there. That's extraordinary. Okay.
It is, and I agree. Some of these innovations really sound like they come out of nowhere, and they could really be a big element in solving the problems we see in the industry.
So how, if these innovations exist, so they're getting attention today, but my understanding from our talks is that it's not as easy as it sounds, right? So what are some of the challenges when developing and scaling innovations for this sector?
Yeah, there are many challenges that a startup would face, and this goes obviously across industries. So even software startups and biotech startups, they all have problems. So when talking about fashion technology or harder technology, so not software tech but hard tech, there's a few items that I would like to highlight that are specifically challenging. And one of the things we see with a lot of these innovations, and especially when talking about raw materials and dyeing technologies and recycling technologies that are really hard techy innovations, it takes a long time to develop these from an idea that often comes out of a university or fundamental research, to transform that into something that can be done in a prototyping in a lab, that can be done in a piloting stage together with a brand or someone, a stakeholder in the industry, towards mainstreaming that and actually being on the market with your product very widely. So when you compare that to, for example, the software industry again, in the software industry, some of these new technologies, if I can call it that way, a new app, can be developed within a year and can be brought to market and really scaled up with millions of users in a period that sometimes is below 2 years. So these type of hard tech innovations, on the contrary, will require sometimes more than 5 years, sometimes more than 10 years to develop all the way to market readiness. So this is one of the difficulties really for these type of innovators that are working on these things, to also get the resources, the financing, the people to work on this for such a long period. I also want to highlight the operational difficulties of the supply chain. When you look at the fashion supply chain, there's not a lot of vertical integration in the fashion supply chain. So if you look at the food industry or automotive or the energy, oil and gas industry, these kind of companies like Starbucks, they are vertically integrated. They run everything. So they do everything from the raw materials to the retail of their consumer goods. So that means there's only a few parties to deal with. If you have a product, then you need to talk to the right people, and if you have a really good innovation, it will be implemented if it contributes to sustainability or their economic bottom line. However, the fashion supply chain is complex in many ways. It lacks that vertical integration, so the brands, the downstream actors, they normally contract manufacturers who then contract tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. So it's very complex, and that results in the industry being very fragmented, relationship driven, and therefore if you have a new innovation, you need to talk to a lot of people, get a lot of people on board before it can actually be implemented. So the third thing I'd like to highlight, if I may, is it's often not possible to gradually scale up with these hard tech innovations. Whereas in software, to mention that again, you can easily build your product over time, have a bit of users, have a bit of revenue, then extend your product more and more and more. With many hard tech innovations, it's really about developing a product till it's market ready and then launch it. That also means there's no stepped approach to building up the company.
Interesting. Yeah, that I hadn't thought so much about. So meaning that you need a finished product before people will be willing to implement it.
Yeah.
There's no sort of middle ground.
That's right.
That's not in the case in all elements, but if you take a Mango Materials or you take a Color Fix, they need to have their stuff pretty much ready to go. There's not a lot more adapting or refining because it's a big investment to work with them. Is that the reason, or?
And it's probably also not an industry that wants to experiment a lot for many years on a product that doesn't quite work yet. It has to be, up to the specs that the manufacturer and the brands need before it gets implemented on a wider scale.
Okay,
so the example you mentioned, it is true that you first need to fine tune your product and then really get it into the market. With many raw materials, in addition to that, it's also the economics of scale. So you need a product that is widely implemented before it's cost competitive. So that also creates a little bit of a chicken and egg problem there.
Yeah, very well put. So let's get into then, because of these challenges, the role of finance in all of this. Tell me what your view is. I asked you how important is it. It's one of a number of things. I would argue with you it's one of a number of things, but it's pretty crucial. So what's your thinking there?
Yes, I agree. And financing is interesting because it develops over time. When it startups, it becomes more and more mature, and it has a pattern that we see with is similar in many innovators. So typically, as I said, a startup would start with out of a university or out of fundamental research, an idea that came up in some sort of general research, and that would typically be funded by a government or a university or the family and friends. So typically, initially, you would require a little bit of capital to get that idea going, and then onwards to a real company, you would normally have seed capital rounds. So the startup trying to get a few $100K or maybe up to 1-2 million to start the company, to fine tune the technology that they've discovered, and that would normally be funded through fools, friends and family, or smaller seed funds, angel investors, those kind of investors. So this then transforms into something that is prototypable, can be pilotable, and then when you move into commercialization of that product, that requires a different amount of capital in many of these innovators. So some of them that we're working with don't actually require a lot of money, have discovered their product with minimum resources, and can now enter the market with their product without requiring 5 or 10 million. But there's many that really need significant money. Also, some of the innovators we talked about today, they require 10 million plus in order to really move their product to something that is commercially implementable. Now, this requires different pockets of money, and then you don't end with the seed funds, but you move towards the sort of early stage venture capital, and then later stage venture capital and growth equity funds.
So that's a great explanation of the different phases, right? Really good. Understanding what sort of during the different development stages funds are needed. So where do you see the problems? Where do you see the challenges in all that?
Yeah, so if you look at that, so what I just outlined, and how much money is needed with some of these innovations to get them to a commercial stage, compare that again to what traditional venture capital has always focused on. So traditional venture capital really came out of the technology industry, out of the semiconductors and software, and that has always been the prime industry for venture capital to invest in. Some of the venture capital has looked at other verticals like healthcare, pharma, solar panels, and battery tech recently. But the real focus on harder technology with these long investment horizons and large tickets that are required in order to bring a technology up to scale, that has never really been the prime focus of venture capital. So between 2006 and 2010-11, you saw some investments in clean tech, and that has paid off for some, but also some venture capital has lost some money in there. So it's still not currently an industry that they would like to invest very deeply in. So very generally, in harder technologies, you would see a gap between the early stage VC and the Wall Street sort of banks that would typically finance any innovator or startup, if you can call it that way, that is very mature and has already successfully implemented their product and has positive cash flows.
So that's quite a challenge for our industry, is to you often talk to me about these valleys of death, right? So you get to a certain stage and everything's going well, but because you can't raise the capital in certain phases, you die, right? So is that what you're describing here?
Yeah, definitely, and it is what we're seeing in some of our innovators as well. When they get to a certain stage and they need this type of capital, so 10 million plus, that is hard to find that capital in the market, and therefore some of the innovations are actually, they have to stall their progress because they can't get the financing they need in order to grow. So I would agree, it is a commercialization valley of death, that point. So typically when talking about valleys of death, you would see a technical valley of death, which is way earlier in the maturity of a startup, which is at the point where a significant capital is needed in order to turn something that looks like an implementable technology but is not quite there yet, to invest in the research phase in order to make it to something that is a prototype or a minimum viable product. So that's the first gap that many innovations are dealing with. But the amounts there are relatively limited. Many of these are looking for operating at minimum cost and looking for a couple $100K. The real problem is in the commercialization phase, where you have a product that is in lab stage or is in a pre-commercial test facility or is still in the garage, and then try to build that into your first facility that can be run on a commercial basis. Look at, for example, chemical recycling. You can set up a test facility that requires a few million, but then your first real facility that's going to require 20 million plus. Who's going to finance that?
That's really interesting, because when I've talked to some people who have had some success, they're at this point where they've done some prototyping or beyond that, they've shown that they can do thousands of tons, but now it's time to scale up to a whole nother level. And even if they've shown they can do it, they haven't shown that they can do it at a large scale, which is what the industry expects. So they say, well, we got to build the first factory to see if that's possible. That could cost us anywhere from what you call 20 million. I heard up to 300 million for a factory.
That's
right?
yes.
I was talking to some people the other day. There's like their new factory is 300 million.
Yeah.
And then if you're going to try to sort of do the volumes that our industry has come to expect or needs to expect as the market grows, you're not talking about one factory, are you? You're talking about hundreds, thousands potentially? That's hard for me to know, but you can get a sense of the scale. If one factory is anywhere between 20 million to 300 million for different products, you start to calculate, wow, this is a lot of money.
Well, the good thing is that once you have your first commercial project and it's actually working, banks will be first in line to finance your second project. Okay. That's how it works.
Yeah.
So once you've got a big commercial facility running and is generating positive cash flows, I think it will be much easier to finance the second project and the third project. So it's really in that, that pre-commercial phase, that is where the gap is.
Okay.
As you said, the corporates may play a role there as well. They are now looking at innovation that needs to be directly implementable. So it needs to be beyond the pilot stage, and it needs to be something that they can use and profit from, either in an environmental way or in an economical way in the next 1 or 2 years. That's the stuff that will really work for them. However, the corporate level of investments into this sector is also relatively low at the moment.
So is that because this sector is not used to doing this kind of work? What do you think? Is historically we have a sense that the apparel sector until recently has not been that sort of technical driven. We do have, of course, suppliers who have very complicated products like the chemical industry, but sort of cut and sew and those kinds of things have been fairly similar for hundreds of years, maybe longer. Is in the world of apparel, this idea of investment and innovation, is that a new thing?
Yeah, that's a good point. We do see that the levels of R&D, with regard to new production methodologies, as opposed to designing clothes, because that obviously has been done, but that real hard tech R&D is a little bit alien to the fashion industry. You compare that to pharma, compare that to chemicals, compare that to semiconductors. They're used to doing some sort of investments that have a longer term horizon into these harder tech innovations. You do note that there's done some R&D upstream. So within the manufacturing step, there are some companies that invest in new production technologies. Look at the Austrian large manufacturer who's really investing in recycling technologies and raw material technologies. But it's unreasonable to think, expect them to do these huge investments of hundreds of millions to support innovators that are coming up in the US and Europe.
So given that, can you mention any of the players who are, in addition to yourselves, that are sort of at least getting into this financing element? I mean, I guess in each of the stages of development, there may be different actors. Is that a fair way of categorizing that?
Yes, and it's definitely that I think is getting increased attention from the funding community, from the venture capital community. Many of these are actually seeing that there's a big opportunity out there. We talked a little bit about chemical recycling and how your second and third project will probably be increasingly financed by traditional bank financing. So once you cover that, next 20 or 50 million, once you have that covered and the innovator grows to a stage where they can conquer the whole world, the opportunities are really endless, and therefore this investment into a chemical recycler can actually pay off a VC type of returns. So we're not talking about doubling your money. It's really, if you're betting on the winning innovation that can be implemented at scale, this could be huge.
So, but getting there, my understanding is that often today you have, in the very beginning, the beginning R&D phase, you may have sort of philanthropic foundations who need to come in, or I don't know where governments come in, all that. But I'm thinking about the ones who are plugging or getting the seed financing are not necessarily the venture capital, right? These are sort of maybe non-commercial funds. How do you sort of describe who's in the field today?
Yeah, so as I said, increasingly I see that new players in the venture capital community are coming into the market with funds that are focused on these type of innovations. So I think in the last years there has been awareness that there's a big opportunity in the fashion tech industry. So I'm hopeful that this will continue to grow in the next couple of years to solve some of these problems we see, to fill some of that gap. But also, you could think of other alliances, for example, between philanthropic money and commercial money to speed up this the interest in the fashion tech sector. And that's actually what we're doing with Fashion for Good as well, with our Good Fashion Fund, which combines philanthropic money with commercial money to try to make manufacturers, so make the supply chain, invest in innovation and make that a mainstream practice.
So we have met other banks, you and I have gathered them actually, to sort of try to understand all this. And one of the things we've heard is that, how attractive are these kinds of investments? Are they, and you said they could be difficult because they're longer term. It means they're higher risk, potentially. I was also thinking that how well are they packaged? Often, people who are into sustainability, who are passionate about it, may not package their solutions in the most commercially effective way. And that may be an obstacle to getting investment. The idea that these are longer term, higher risk means that maybe you need to mix investment in things that are shorter term and can turn a profit more quickly with a bundle of those are high risk that if one captures the market they will do a great job. So I was just thinking about some of these additional financial obstacles. Is this an attractive investment at this point and it just has to be repackaged, or do we need to do some additional changes there?
I think there's two elements to that. On the one hand, there's probably investor awareness needs to increase to really focus on these opportunities that are out there. On the other hand, you could say, are these opportunities interesting enough for the traditional investors? Could they repackage it in a way that that attracts a broader audience than just a few VC funds that are currently focused on this fashion tech niche, if you can call it that way? So we've seen some successes with some of the more mature startups that have gone through successfully through the commercialization valley of death by repositioning themselves not only as a fashion tech company, but wider. So as a biotech company or a 3D printing company that is not solely focused on footwear soles, but is focused really across several verticals and is able to attract corporate investments, but also venture capital investments from all these different verticals.
Okay, so going beyond the fashion industry to be able to deliver things to different industries.
That's
and that
definitely
makes them much more valuable, obviously.
Yes, yeah. and we also heard that in the last few days in Vancouver during these sessions that people who've successfully gone through this, that venture capitalists are also looking not to put all of their eggs in one basket, but also to diversify and try, if one vertical, the focus on one vertical fails, they also have the other verticals to focus on.
That's a great point. That's a very important point. Okay.
Well, one of the things, obviously, that you see with some of our innovators is that if you're very specifically focusing on a dyeing technology, it can be difficult in translating that into other industries. But you could also look at the textiles in automotive, for example.
So I want to sort of take a step back because we've delved into a lot of these sort of innovation development challenges and how to get money into them. And I want to step back and look at it through the lens of sustainability performance, right? So we have an idea that we need these innovations to close the loop, to reduce water, so that we're doing water stewardship, to reduce carbon emissions so that we have zero plus positive, carbon positive. There's some real clear science-based goals that our industry needs to meet if we're going to contribute to a sustainable society. By 2040, for instance, we need to be climate positive. Are the current approaches that we're investing in, do we know that they're sufficient to solve these, to achieve these kinds of science-based targets? And in thinking about that, because I'm imagining, okay, we take mango materials, which sounds brilliant, right? It's capturing methane and turning that into fiber or buttons or things like that. So you can imagine if that's scaled up, that could sort of significantly reduce the carbon intensity or the methane intensity in our whole planet, kind of thing. But other innovations maybe are just increasing the improvements by 20%, 30%, such. Do we know how much of these innovations need to be successful for us to reach these goals? Do we know how much financial investment is needed to ensure that at least some of these get to scale and transform the industry? How do you all think about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in your question, and one thing is certain: there's definitely a lot to be done in the fashion industry. And as I said, the issues are large, and the incremental upgradation doesn't always cut it. So we need these kind of bolder innovations to get us there. There's really a variety of issues in the fashion supply chain, and some of them have been mapped in some detail, especially with the recent research that has come out over the last couple of years, so that we can get a feel of where we need to focus our attention within the different steps in the supply chain. But there's also a lot of different elements that haven't been researched in that much detail. So we don't even know what exactly the problem is, how large it is, and how we could even start in beginning to solve that. So when you see microfiber shedding, for example, it's almost a recent issue, it's a relatively recent issue, and people are still trying to wrap their head around how big the issue is. Should we focus on it? Should it be a priority? And how do we even start addressing that problem?
So, but let me jump in here, because I'm even interested on the finance side. Being a layperson here, and I'm trying to do the math, right? My first question is, okay, how many of these startups do we need to invest in, right, to increase our chances, right? We're playing a game of statistics. We're betting that a couple of them who have real sustainability impact are taken up and are spread throughout the industry, right?
Yeah. Well, the exact path of innovation is very hard to predict. And we see a lot of different, very disruptive technologies, but we're still a bit in the dark on which ones are really going to make it and which ones eventually have some sort of problem or cannot be implemented by the industry. So we see a lot of innovation, and that's positive, as I'm sure that funnel, that large group of innovations will bring some promising results finally. And we see this already underlined in the latest Pulse of the Industry report that came out a few weeks ago, that parts of the supply chain have actually increased a lot in score. Other parts of the supply chain, such as raw materials, probably have a long way, a very uncertain way ahead to really improve. So it's hard to know how far we are in identifying the technologies that we need to really transform the sector. And when it comes to what type of technologies we need, in the energy sector, there was a lot of expectations on relating to biofuels based on algae, and we were thinking that this would eventually lead to complete transformation of the industry. However, it hasn't really delivered on those expectations.
And what I think you're also implying, tell me if I'm wrong, is that we have some new research that's starting to categorize this, but I haven't seen, if you're talking about here's our carbon budget, and then sort of taking the existing technologies and saying, if these were scaled up, this is how much we would be able to address that issue. And then here's where there's a big gap. Or water. We don't really have a sense yet how much of a mixed bag of these things could get us to the goals,
right,
do
yeah.
we?
And I think that's very important. For the first step in that is to have the current footprint, very accurately shown. And this is one of the things that researchers have been working on in the last couple of years. And you also have been involved in trying to make a roadmap on where we want to go in, you mentioned 2040, for example. And then the third step is to make a bridge of what type of innovations are needed in each step of the supply chain in order to get us there.
And then how much investment is needed to get those there, right?
Yes.
So here's where I want to sort of round off our discussion, which is, talking about the financial gap. Are we talking about, and I know it depends on where in the supply chain or in the life cycle of fashion products. I know it depends on what type of innovation we're talking about. But are we talking about millions of dollars, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars that needs to flow into just our sector in order for us to get us a chance to transform?
Right. Yeah. That's the key question. And I think you can look at the different problems out there in the supply chain and try to isolate those and try to look at what innovations are currently there, how much capital do they need, and what are the chances then that these innovators will actually grow to something that is mainstreamed, that is widely implemented, and therefore takes care of the problems. One of the things I highlighted already is that in raw materials, there's a lot of innovation going on, which is in not so very mature stages. So lots of innovations are still in lab stage or in piloting stage, and it's unsure to. I wouldn't be able to tell which innovations are going to make it, and if any of those innovations are going to make it to mainstream. One of the steps of the supply chain that really stands out is chemical recycling. In chemical recycling, we've seen a lot of innovation in the last 10 years or so, and there is a limited group, so you can get a good overview of the different innovators that are working on that problem and the sort of capital they need, which is mostly between 10 and $100 million in order to grow from their current maturity into something that is starting to commercialize and then can attract bank financing to expand very rapidly throughout the world. So yeah, with these kind of steps, you can actually tell, okay, there's probably 10 to 20 innovators working on this. If they all need 100 million, you can get sort of a feel for what type of a quantum are we talking about in getting us there.
And do we have, let's just take chemical recycling. Is that money today available?
That is the question.
Okay.
And there's definitely a huge opportunity there, as I said. Also, a lot of different funders are now seeing that and realizing that this should be something they need to look at because the opportunity is so large. But it remains to be seen whether that entire funding requirement can actually be financed in the next couple of years.
So it would be very interesting for us to get some more feedback, and I know you and I have talked about that, from those who maybe have been working with renewable energies and such. It's not the same industry, it's different, but who have done the calculations on how many of these you got to fund and in order to get a few up there and running by the time frames that we need. And those maybe calculation models could help us have a much more realistic sense, because there's so much talk, which there always is by the leading players around the circular vision, right, where we need to be. But when it comes down to it, certain time frames are very clear, stipulated by the scientists. And if we're going to have honest and serious discussions, we need to put our money where our mouth is, don't we? And to put our money where our mouth is means actually understanding the realities of how much money is needed. And figuring out if the brands aren't going to be able to put that kind of cash in, if some foundations don't have that, if governments may not have that, how are we going to create this flow? How are we going to structure new instruments potentially to release this? in a world where people want, some safety and security in their returns, right? And in an industry that we have, which is fragmented, some of the innovations could take 5 to 10 years to develop, which we don't really have. How do we accelerate that while at the same time releasing the capital flows that give people some security that they're going to get a return on their investment, right? Is that a fair description of the challenge ahead?
That's definitely true, and that's why we're working now with different stakeholders in the industry and trying to get different groups of different pockets of capital together in one room to discuss this problem and to really try and see what the next steps are in researching this issue further, so trying to map where the gaps are and if they actually exist, and then how to address these problems. And we talked a little bit about the potential solutions, but there might be things that we're currently overlooking that could also hugely progress this.
So do I get invited to that meeting?
You are already.
Full transparency. So what we're doing is we had some good meetings already, didn't we? But we need to, in a couple of weeks, we'll be gathering some more. You always don't want to overanalyze, but in this case, it sounds like we need to do some rigorous analysis to really know where we stand.
Yeah.
And then begin to figure out what kinds of different, solutions could help address this gap. So if you were to choose one thing, let's end there. If you were to choose one thing, you had to choose one thing. I know we're not being very nuanced here, but if you had to choose one thing in the next 2 to 3 years that could really accelerate a solution to this challenge of financing and bridging the finance gap, is there one thing you would say this is what we should prioritize?
Well, I mean, when you look at history, governments have never been very fast. So if you look at, if I'm being asked, in the next couple of years, what's really going to make a difference? It's probably not that pool of money that exists with the government. So I would focus my attention on trying to bring in traditional investors or hard tech investors, so those kind of venture capital money, into the industry and trying to persuade them that this is really, or trying to show them that this is a really interesting a vertical to look at, and there's potentially a lot of money to be made, because essentially that's what they are being drawn at.
Okay, that's a great proposal. Well, I want to really thank you. That wasn't so painful, was it? Was it?
Not at all.
No, you're a genius. You're very articulate, and this has been brilliant to try to get a sense of where we stand today. And I know there's a lot more nuanced questions that you and I and others are working through, and we'll probably reconnect around those in the future to sort of flush those out. But this has been brilliant, and we're really looking forward to reporting back, aren't we, on the meeting we're going to host in a couple weeks to figure out if that's taken us farther in this discussion. And we're very much encouraging all of you who listen, who have expertise in this area or opinions, to get in touch with us and to give us your sense how you think we can address these challenges. So, Rogier?
Almost correct.
Right, it's embarrassing. Thank you very, very much for today.
Of course, thank you for having me.